Okay, now, from the beginning.
Hit it, boys.
So tonight's topic is trust. It's a foundation of every society, every relationship, and definitely a building block of democratic process. So the notion of truth, however, has taken a battering. I don't know if anyone saw in 2016, it was the word of the year. And it just sums up a current climate where objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than emotional appeal. So today we've got living proof. I think we can all reference Brexit and Trump. And it's not just fake news as well. We've got fake science manufactured by climate change deniers and anti-vaccciners. It's fake history promoted by Holocaust revisionists and white supremacists. Fake Americans on Facebook created by Russian trolls, and fake followers and likes on social media generated by bots. So this topic is just so far-reaching, but thankfully we have three experts to help us pass our way through this. I'd like to introduce them and welcome them to the stage. So Kate McClymont is 7-time winner of journalists' most prestigious award, the Walkley, and she's won the Gold Walkley as well. She's undoubtedly Australia's leading investigative journalist. She spent 3 decades recognising and revealing deception, from the jockey tapes of 1995, which is kind of where you really cut your teeth. That was very interesting. The Canterbury Bulldogs salary cap breaches, 6 years of unearthing the widespread political corruption of the Obeid family, and very recently the outing of Don Burke as well, with Tracy Spicer as a sexual predator. So she's also just finished her manuscript for I don't know if you recall, the Michael McGurk assassination. So it was Point Piper property developer Ron Medich. And it really reads like a Hollywood tale that McGurk contacted Kate just a week before he was gunned down in his home and said that he had a tape, and you never got to speak to him after that. He feared for his life. So I encourage you, when you see that on the shelves, to pick that up. But please welcome Kate to the stage. I'll get you right in the middle. So Reverend Toby Neal, it feels strange to call you Reverend. So in the interest of truth, Toby's my pastor, but he's ordained Anglican Minister at Vine Church. It's a young creative church in Surrey Hills. I'm actually probably the oldest person there. There's a few other ones there. But I love how Toby weaves together pop culture and art and history and all sorts of things to kind of reveal biblical truths. And I also appreciate just how he sort of hold on to that idea of an absolute truth in an age where we're going to unpack it, where people are really looking for that truth. So I'm also proud that some of the things that Vine Church do are the Bread of Life, which is for people living on the margins. It's a breakfast service. Made with Love, which is reaching out to women in the brothels around Surrey Hills, and also the Mardi Gras, which is great because the parade goes right past Mardi Gras. So I think for the church to sort of be there and be a support and to kind of encourage conversation is really positive. So please welcome Toby to the stage. I wasn't going to embarrass him because he's got very cool pastime, which is surfing, but also very uncool, which is you're researching Puritans, and it's like a niche area of interest. So I won't mention that anyway. And this brings me to Professor Nick Enfield. Enfield. I keep putting an I in at the start there. I'm really honoured to have Nick on the panel as well. He founded the Sydney Initiative for Truth. And it's just really incredible, I think, what Nick is doing to bring together people that are really championing truth. There was a name change because people weren't sure if you were pro or, what it was, your stance on truth. But very much it's all about looking for what is the problem of this current age and how can we solve it. Interestingly, Nick's background, he's head of linguistics at the University of Sydney, and he's written 18 books. But I love the book, How We Speak, which is all about the non-verbal word, like the So if we hear some of those, they're legitimate words as well. And it's worth having a look at the site, the Sydney Institute for Truth. So SIFT is how I'll abbreviate it tonight. But he's got psychologists and data scientists and media, politics, health. So everything is involved. So please welcome Nick to the stage as well. Right here. So if anyone's been to the Basilica, the Gaudi's amazing Basilica in Barcelona, you would have seen a huge sign at the front there, and it's got in all different language, what is truth? And I want to start with that, just to ask each of you, what is truth to you? So who do I pick on? Toby.
I think it's interesting that, this word post-truth, the word of the year according to the Oxford Dictionary, which, said that circumstances in which objective facts are less influential than appeals to emotion and personal beliefs on forming people's opinions on certain things. And, it's interesting as you look at that, why has that word popped up in our culture? The Jewish people, they had 10 commandments, Christians have 2. But I think as we look around our culture, our commandments are, you need to be true to yourself, don't let anyone else tell you what to do. And the third is that individual happiness is the meaning to life. And I think if you look at those 3 commandments, which really do shape our society, it's easy to see why the truth, absolute truth, becomes something which is irrelevant, and why appeals to emotion are so powerful. And it's because we're all pursuing our own individual happiness. Don't let anyone else tell you how to be you. And as a result, truth becomes unimportant. What becomes important is, well, what will make me feel good? What will make me feel happy? Because happiness is the meaning of life. So in my mind, it's not surprising that we've entered into this cultural moment where, in a post-truth environment, where appeals to emotion are more credible to people than appeals to fact and evidence. Yeah.
So I don't want to create a Galileo moment and pitch science against kind of religion, but for you, Nick, you come from a science background, so how do you look at truth?
Well, I probably would start from kind of the linguistic background, because to me, truth is something that's about statements that we make. So truth is really the property of being true. And what things are true? Well, statements are true, or they might be false. So my sense of, that sort of version of truth is quite a unproblematic one, a very sort of simple one. And I like to ground it in really everyday concerns, right? So if I say, there's no soy milk in the fridge, okay, is it true or is it false? You can go open the fridge and you can check it. And, in most of our day, we're concerned with a lot of little claims like that, because these things give us reasons to act. If there's no soy milk in the fridge, I've got to go down to the shop and get some. I come back, I find out that it was there all along. What's going on? So in our everyday life, from moment to moment, we're actually incredibly concerned with the truth of a whole lot of small things. But we, if you just randomly tell me that there's no soy milk in the fridge and it turns out there is, that's a problem. Right, so I think we negotiate truth. We look at truth a lot, but oftentimes in these discussions around truth, we quickly get into deep questions, which are important ones. But at the same time, the questions that we're most often interested in are ones about, is this assertion that this person is making actually the truth or false? And so that's a property of language. It's a property of claims that people make, and it's something that you can go and test by looking for evidence.
And I'd like to come back to that idea of in relationship as well, because I think that's the context that it's couched in. So for you, Kate, it's a bit more of a legal thing. How would you look at it?
No, but it's also that thing now whereby truth seems to be in the eye of the beholder. Because there's such an erosion of trust in experts, in the media, in our politicians. In the past, we used to rely on a scientist to say, this is true. But now, you just take climate change. People don't respect truth tellers anymore. And I sort of think there is no such thing as the absolute truth anymore, because the media, our politicians, corporate players, truth is all a relative thing now, and I think it's really affecting our society in a deeply troubling way.
And Kate's mentioned the erosion of truth, and there's a term called truth decay, which is really interesting. It's by the RAND Corporation, and there's 2,000 kind of accredited researchers that are working on for government, FBI, lots of agencies, that they basically go around and find what's true and false. And they have put together this idea of the 5 things why we have truth decay at the moment. It's a blurring of line between opinion and fact, our own cognitive bias, which I'm going to ask you about, Nick, social media's disruption of the environment of information, prevalence of opinion and anecdote over fact, and the declining trust in respected source of fact. So I think just to frame our discussion, perhaps if we look at this idea of cognitive bias and how does that come into, a little bit like that, echo chambers, how do we really sort of perpetuate our own, perhaps, misinformation?
Yeah, cognitive bias is very important as far as I'm concerned in this whole discussion. I mean, I think a lot of what we're talking about is ultimately grounded in individual decisions, individual, the way that individuals process what they hear, the way that individuals interpret, what gets fed to them. And so there's this kind of filter that everything has to go through, and that's our mind. So we've learned from the science of mind, psychology, and so on over decades that there's this incredible array of what are known as cognitive biases, and these are basically flaws in our perception, flaws in our thinking, bugs in the way that we process information, which often allow us to think quickly and think in ways that are kind of low cost, but they also have notorious kind of they're called flaws and bugs for a reason, right? They make us just come to decisions which are not to our advantage. They allow us to be manipulated by people who use language in certain ways. So, for example, there's something called an anchor bias, and that is where if you are asked to estimate something like, for example, what would this vase cost in a shop? And I ask you what you think it would cost. Well, you might just pick some number, but if I say, what do you think it costs? I think $100. You're going to be anchored to that 100, and you're going to say something like, well, maybe 120 if you think it's more, or maybe 80. But if I say to you, what do you think it costs? I think 200. Then you're going to anchor to that, even though the information I gave you is not, in the vase. So we get played very often in how we interpret what's going on, how we, how readily we accept statements that are being made because of these sort of pitfalls just they're part of our internal sort of wiring, as it were. We're not computers, we're not machines, and we're very good at thinking, but we're often quite poor at overriding these kind of bugs in how we think.
So I wonder, Kate, how do we play on that? If there's also there's a book I'm reading, Factfulness, which is behind here, and it talks about one of our human biases, one of these heuristics they're called, is the negative. We're attracted to negative information. So that's what media is kind of espousing all the time, because that's what sells papers. How do you respond to that idea?
Look, I think it's a deep worry in some ways, because today you're far more, the media's far more to cover the ravings of a complete lunatic like Fraser Anning than to actually cover something that a sensible person says. So, how do you deal with that? I mean, if you write a sensible but boring story, who's going to read it? If you write, this lunatic is saying that, all Jews should be killed, you're outraged, and it's a really complex story. And I think Nathan was mentioning to us beforehand that the news organisation Junkie, which is, basically pitched for younger people, is called News Without the Boring Bits. And that's a whole thing, in the past, we used to have 3 or 4 newspapers. We used to have nightly television and the radio. And you got the news at either 7 o'clock or 6 o'clock. You got the papers in the morning, and that was it. You didn't get your news from anywhere else. So you basically had to trust that those papers or those organisations were telling you the truth. Now, where you can get news from Facebook, from Twitter, from a whole different, organisation, it's less likely that you know what is actually true. And I sort of feel in some ways that because of the preponderance of, news organisations, there's now a realisation that the major newspapers, or perhaps not all of them, but some of them, in fact, you can trust them to be telling you accurate stuff. And as soon as I'm saying that, I'm thinking of the Daily Telegraph on on Anzac Day, which had a front page story basically saying that according to health professionals, Labor policies are going to encourage transgender operations in young children. It was based on the opinion of one doctor who's been largely discredited, but this was a front page story. And you think, if your major media organisations can't do these things properly, I mean, I can understand why there's just a huge erosion in trust, and with a huge erosion in trust is a huge erosion in what's true.
And I'm going to pick up on that, the idea of institutions, and ask you, Toby, because the barometer for trust in institutions is the Enderman report, and it's been going for since 2000, and it basically surveys thousands and thousands of people across different countries. In 2017, for the first time, the study found that trust had declined across all 4 areas, which is media, government, NGOs, and business. So it seems we have a real problem with authority, Toby, or is it that we just don't know who to put our trust in?
Yeah, that's a good question. And as I look at the church, we're one of the institutions which has had an erosion of trust. People don't trust us. And, it's shocking to watch SBS Christians like us and watch that 50-year-old man who was serially sexually raped as a kid, and then his mother died, seems to be caused by the stress of him telling her. And then he had to go serve at the funeral conducted by the man who'd raped him. And it's just evil. It's thoroughly evil. So there's objective truth for you. There's objective evil. And I think we're quite happy declaring that to be evil. As I think about the church, though, a friend of mine helped me understand, why is it that Christians do bad things? And he likened it to a Bach cello. If you get Yo-Yo Ma, the greatest cellist in the world, to play a Bach concerto, that'll sound very differently to me playing it. And we ought not to judge the value of a composition by the one who performs it. Jesus Christ, he wrote a stunning composition of life. He said that we are to love our enemies, and from the cross he prayed for the forgiveness of those killing him. And so Christians are evil. They do terrible things, but as a Christian, that doesn't erode my trust in the Lord Jesus, who I think there's no one more trustworthy. And in an age where it's so hard to find the truth, I find him very refreshing, because everything he says, he backs up in his actions.
So if we come back to you, Nick, with your scientific method, because that's almost come out of the Enlightenment, where it's almost about science is about doubting and testing. So how do you respond to things in these meta-narratives that Toby's talking about? They're things that you can't touch and feel necessarily. So how do you respond to that as a professor?
Well, I mean, in science, there've been breakthrough after breakthrough in making things visible that didn't used to be visible. I think that, of course, there are things that we can't see because they're too small. And there are things that happen at that sort of scale, and over time scientists make inventions that allow them to test their hypotheses, or things are too big, they're too far away, and over time those problems of access to the world get solved through essentially sort of through inventions. The barriers are only in your vision, in a sense, that over time, you can build and build and build towards getting access to that sort of information. I think I also wanted to comment on this question about trust in institutions that both Kate and Toby mentioned. I think one of the sort of fundamental issues here is money. And I mean, it's obviously, we were talking just before that, you know, in media, in journalism, the whole clickbait phenomenon is completely transparently about money, about, you know, each click sells a certain, you know, bit of advertising and money comes in. So whatever gets eyes on that page is what we want, and that's the, you know, purely the only reason, you know, why the boring stuff doesn't make it. In science, you've got, you know, money affecting it in other kinds of ways. You have the journals in which scientific findings are published. They're proliferating, they're, you know, because of the internet and because of, you know, the democratization of information and so on. It's an absolute flood of information. Not very well regulated journals, which, you know, now there's a new thing called predatory publishing where, you know, essentially I'll publish whatever you give me as long as you pay me this amount of money. Yeah. You pollute the infosphere essentially, and then, you know, through that would be one mechanism by which trust kind of goes down. And that's a problem, but there are checks and balances.
Tell us about those.
Well, I mean, science itself is based on this idea of doubt and subjecting your hypotheses to, you know, to that doubt and saying, okay, I'm going to act as if I'm going to try to prove myself wrong here. And so your colleagues should also do the same thing. And if all goes to plan, that's what happens. And people have a hypothesis, they put forward this idea, and others come in and say, I think you're wrong, and I'm going to show why that is. And, you know, so you have things like, for example, replication. Toby was saying earlier just before we got on stage, that there is a problem in science at the moment in some fields where people are unable to replicate the experiments that others did. Now, that's a problem, obviously, but it's good that we know it, because, and the reason why we know it is because scientists are motivated to come out and try to replicate a finding, find that they can't, publicize that fact, and then everyone comes and says, oops, we've got a problem now, let's go back to the original study, let's retract that paper. You know, we have a whole system of retraction and, you know, really good sites that look at that. So there are institutional checks and balances, and individuals in science a lot of them are motivated to insist on those being followed.
And I want to follow the idea of motivation of money and ask you, Kate, because you see the seedy underbelly of life, like we said, from the top of government down to kind of the literally gangland. So what do you see about human nature? Is it money at the core of a lot of these crimes? Is
of course.
Power? Yeah.
And in Sydney, it's real estate.
Yeah.
It's location. Look, absolutely. And I think, you know, that one of the reasons why Sydney has been such a corrupt place is that, you know, there's very valuable land. And, you know, people think that, you know, federal government or the state government is where corruption lies. In fact, corruption is most commonly at your local government, because that's where, you know, you can give the mayor's wife a second-hand Honda Civic and you'll get another 4 floors on. And because of, but it is like, in fact, and also, you just don't have any idea of the dullards that we have in many of our local governments. In fact, last week in ICAC, there was a former Liberal councillor from Canterbury Council giving evidence. And he said, you know what it's like? It's like when you're between a rock and is it a rock and a hard-boiled egg? And you think, this was someone who was making multi-million-dollar decisions, and he thinks it's a rock and a hard-boiled egg. So, and the other thing is that because of the erosion in media, it also means that our local papers, which used to keep an eye on these people, they're all folding. They don't have journalists. So the monetisation of crime is being advanced because of the lack of people to properly patrol it, and that also transfers into institutions like ASIC and the banks, and the regulators. Whenever they're not funded, you'll see what happened with the Banking Royal Commission when, people would complain to ASIC who just didn't have enough staff to actually ever look at anything. So I just think the economics of modern day life is really affecting our democracy.
Yeah. And Toby, that again plays into a biblical principle of money being the corruption and all evil. But is there something else at play in the hearts of men that sort of, do we not want to know the truth? Do we buck the idea of authority and...
The Bible has this idea of the radical selfishness of human beings, and Alain de Botton, not a Christian, an atheist writer, he says that this idea of original sin, it's actually very helpful, and he applies it to marriage. If you go into marriage unaware of the radical selfishness of the other person, you're very unprepared for what's going to happen in that relationship. And so Christianity teaches this, that human beings, we are radically self-centred, and that's part of our problem. And we need a cure, we need a saviour for that. And, that's, it's not just institutions, it's each one of us, that we all have reasons for the lies that we tolerate and the way we cover up the truth. And the Bible names that and says you need help with that, yeah.
So, Nick, last week you published an article in The Guardian just likening this sort of era of post-truth to an epidemic where it's not just that we are espousing lies, but if we're liking something, we're sort of perpetuating. Tell us a bit about that and your thinking.
Sure. Well, the idea with that, I was drawing an analogy between, the concept of inoculation or vaccination against diseases in a population and, the spread of false information in a population. So the way that, vaccination is explained by experts is that, you have to have a certain percentage, quite high percentage of the population to be vaccinated. And once you get below that threshold, then the whole sort of system starts to break down. You need,
we do have a vaccination expert. Where's Mary? Mary's a vaccination expert.
So, there are these terms of herd immunity and so forth.
Is it right?
Roughly right. Okay. Tolerably right. But
truth.
But my view about this truth problem is that the trust that is out there in society is like immunity to that kind of a breakdown and disease. So as soon as you irresponsibly pass on information that is consequential, then it's an unethical thing to do. And so the analogy that I drew was between, with the claims that people have made about people who don't vaccinate their kids as doing something wrong to society, not only to their kids and themselves, but also to society broadly. So, that's what I think is going on. And I think that trust is like currency, that if you pollute the sort of infosphere in that way, then eventually you have a collapse, and that I think is what we're seeing. It's not quite like a bubble bursting, but it's that the currency loses its value, and once you lose trust, then we're in trouble, and that is because truth. You can't just choose facts, right? You can choose facts within some tolerable range. You can certainly choose opinions, but when it comes to facts like are these mushrooms poisonous or are they safe to eat? It doesn't matter what you believe about them. You'll still, keel over and die if they happen to be poisonous mushrooms, and that's the truth.
Yeah. That reminds me of Nick and I were talking. It was a story about in Southeast Asia, one of the practices they had that was really unhelpful for them. I think they were eating the brains of the deceased.
This was in Papua New Guinea. It's a famous case in anthropology that a particular group were eating the brains of their dead relatives as a cultural practice. And, it was done for certain reasons that were, there was a value within the society of this practice and a certain motivation behind it, but people were getting ill because of it. They were getting a particular kind of virus that was caused by ingesting these brains. And there are many, many examples that are like that. The belief that it was a good thing was not going to change the fact of what it was doing to them physically.
And it reminds me, in my research, there was a quote by Patrick Daniel Moynihan, who was, I think, Nixon's one of his Senate kind of supporters, and he said that you're entitled to your own opinion but not your own facts. So, Kate, if we look at that idea, the journalist's version of a Hippocratic oath is to tell the truth, and you can obviously have your personal opinion, but it's to always make sure you're accurate. And maybe talk to us about that and whether you think that journalistic integrity is here.
Well, look, I think that journalistic integrity is in place in the major media organisations, but the problem is that, for people who've got, for young people or people who've got children, how many of them get their information from sitting down and reading a newspaper? Not many. And you just have to look at the lead up to the election of Donald Trump. There were the 20 top stories about Donald Trump that were shared that were fake, and they had 9 million shares. So the number one was shock news: Pope endorses Donald Trump. So
True, Toby?
This was the 20 fake stories were shared so much more. But the thing is, how do we combat that? Like, the horse has bolted. Like, you can then get academics, you can get people to say it's not true. But that false information is already out there circulating, and it's impossible to stop. And I think that's what is a real worry, is the circulation of fake information and almost the inability to stop it. And, at the same time, on a more local level, we have the same problem with the media in that, with shrinking newsrooms, you'll notice that there's an expert on something that everyone goes to. Whether or not that person is good or not, they're available, people have their phone number. So that one person's views get escalated beyond, because people can't be bothered going out and finding another person. So, we are as much to blame as anyone. I was saying to Toby and Nick beforehand that when I started at the Herald so many years ago, we had like 4 health and science reporters, and they were experts in their field. We had someone dedicated solely to covering the High Court. We had a religious reporter. We had an industrial relations reporter. That's all gone. And, you see in our papers, you see on especially breakfast TV, where some institution will have paid for the study, like a pharmaceutical company, will hand that information to the station saying, 18 bottles of red wine a week's great for you. And, people just regurgitate press releases. So actually countering the effect of that wrong information is something that it's a real worry, and I don't know what the answer is. Like, get it right in the first place would be the best.
Yeah, that's true. It's interesting because we're told that we're in the information age, but it's really the misinformation age. There's so much access to information. And again, Toby, if you look at centuries ago, missionaries would go out to spread the gospel. I think anyone can on their phone read the Bible, but why aren't we engaging kind of with these deeper ideas? What do you think's happening?
Ask the question again. I wasn't paying attention. I was still caught up on what Kate was saying.
No, the question is, why read the Bible when you can read New Idea?
Yeah, answer that one.
I think
it's kind of obvious, but
people can access anything. People can read the Quran or the Bible or anything. So why aren't we engaging? People can read.
A lot of people say that the Bible, Christianity is opposed to science, but. And a lot of people today dismiss Christianity and they say it's unscientific. But this week I was reflecting on the different kinds of truth claims. So there's mathematical truth claims, 1 + 1 = 2, scientific truth claims, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. There's legal truth claims, did this person murder this person? There's historical claims, Australia landed in Gallipoli. There's experiential truth claims, I make a really nice slow-cooked lamb. And there's relational truth claims, my wife loves me. And each one of those truth claims needs different justifications. And each one of the justifications for each one of those truth claims differ. And so mathematics relies on deductive knowledge, science inductive, that you need repeatable, observable tests. But history doesn't depend on repeatable, observable tests, because history, it's not repeatable. You can't get Australia to land in Gallipoli again to prove whether they did or didn't in the start of the 20th century. And then there's experiential truth claims. And to test experiential truth claims, you've actually just got to eat the roast lamb and see what it's like. And then there's relational truth claims. And I've got to trust my wife when she says, I love you. I've got to trust that. And I've got to look for other corroboration for that.
That she likes your lamb, for instance.
Yeah, for instance. But I think a lot of people come to Christianity and religion and they're just looking for mathematical or scientific, and we don't apply that to the rest of life. Christianity has a historical claim that Jesus rose from the dead. It's also got a relational claim that God loves us. And the way you test that is not in a test tube with observable, repeatable experiments, but it's the kind of thing you test whether Australia landed in Gallipoli or not. It's open to historical investigation. And so as a Christian, I find the historical evidence very, very, very credible, but relationally, I find the experience of God who loves me very, very real as well. So that's how I come to read the Bible and not new idea.
Okay. So let's talk about relationship, because we're talking about truth. And then the flip of that, well, I guess the extension of that is trust, as in that's an interpersonal experience. So talk to us, Nick, about kind of, if you look at social media, it's a lot of people are sending things without the context of relationships. So can you tell us about societies and how they rely on trust?
Yeah, well, I mean, my perspective, so I work as a linguist, I work on endangered languages in Laos, and I travel in Southeast Asia and work with quite small communities and document their languages. So there's a whole kind of technical aspect of what I do there. But a big part of that work and the work of my colleagues in this field takes us into societies that are very different from the large-scale technological society that we're living in now, the newspaper readers, the internet users. And in that field of study, what we're really looking at is some kind of very, let's say, fundamental mode of organization of human society. And the difference is really scale. So there's claims made about how society is organized. For example, Robin Dunbar is an anthropologist who's claimed that, we have an ideal size of a village, let's say, an ideal size of a community, and it's quite a small number of people, something like 100. Yeah, exactly. 150, around that number, is the people that you would kind of know well and that you would have a relationship with, and that you would also understand the relationship between each of those individuals and who's related to whom in what way. And once you get above that level, then, the relationships are more distant, and there's a lot less investment in the relationship with those other people. So one of the crucial things about working in that type of a society is that, you're not just going to lie to people willy-nilly. You're not just going to trick people willy-nilly, because you're going to see those people the next day and the next day, and the day after that and the day after that. There's no anonymity. And so trust is invested in, just as you said about, if someone says that they love you or someone says that they're related to you in a certain kind of way.
So I wouldn't believe any of that.
Well, they have to, they have to also back that up with all of these other actions, and they have to, you need to see evidence that fits with, your interpretation of all of these, interpersonal relationships. So when you scale up society in the way that we've radically done, in only the smallest part of our history, then it's really no surprise that all these problems are occurring. And it's the anonymity and the great distance, and particularly in the internet age, the fact that you can now get communities gelling and cohering where the people are just distributed around the globe. The tiniest, most niche interest groups can now form very powerful communities, right, and kind of get to know each other. So the underlying mechanisms of social relations aren't changing. We are humans and we are a certain way. but our the potential for forming communities is just radically transformed.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm going to end on with each of you more for a solution of how do we navigate forward, and then I'll throw it open to, so maybe off the back of that, Nick, what is the solution as far as us being able to tell what is true and what is credible in society from your perspective, and what is the work of SIFT in helping us do that?
Well, I personally think that I mean, this is also coming a bit off what Kate was saying before. I think ultimately it's about individual responsibility. And that's because, no matter what fact-checking you do, no matter what legislation you put in place, no matter what you do with the internet or, with the big Facebooks of the world, you won't stop the stem of misinformation. But what you can do is try to promote a kind of what I think of as a kind of cognitive literacy, a kind of literacy about our own limitations, about all of the things we've been talking about, and get people to understand that we can actually be the gatekeepers of all of this sort of misinformation. So because we're the ones who do the clicks, because we're the ones that pay the money to the groups and so on, if only we could, be smart enough, we could stop that sort of a flow. So I think that there's an individual responsibility is a big part of that. And so, I mean, essentially in terms of what SIFT does, it starts with education, with becoming informed and becoming motivated to understand why these problems are occurring, and then to try to use that knowledge to overcome them.
So for you, Kate, you've seen huge changes in the industry and journalism. Do you think that the whole landscape can recalibrate so then we do again have some sense of trust? What do you think?
I think it's really interesting to look at, say, the Sydney Morning Herald, which is now the most read newspaper in the country. We have 8.9 million, I think, individual reads. This is over digital, of course, and print. So I think that people are realising that if you want the truth, you have to pay for it. I know that sounds terrible, but if you want, if you want to fund proper journalism, you have to pay for it. And I look at, say the Washington Post and the New York Times, which have had enormous resurgence since Trump, and their revenues have gone up. The problem here in Australia is that we've got small economies of scale. We're never going to have that kind of population to fund our journalism. But I just think it's great that, the mastheads that people can trust in are actually being reflected in increased readership. But that then is a big onus on us to deliver a quality product, to deliver things that are accurate and that are true, and to not to be biased about things. Because, you can see bias in everything. Oh, not so much our paper.
Very good. And Toby,
she's biased.
To bring it back to you, so we talked about that cultural relativity at the top, so kind of us all having our own beliefs, which again can be very valid. Someone's truth is what they believe. So how do you think we kind of should respond to this?
Well, I'm exhausted by all the claims of the academics, the journalists and everything that I read, and I'm always left wondering what ought I to believe, and I find it very hard to trust anyone in our cultural moment. And I long for someone who would actually just tell me the truth, and they would be true. And that's what I found in Jesus Christ, someone who never lies, who's always true to his word. And that's, I guess, the rock on which I live. And then I live in a world with lots of lies, and I've just got to cope with that. I don't think there is a solution to that. And my solution is put your trust in Jesus. I would say that, wouldn't I?
So let's get some questions from the floor, and I'm going to throw some books out there if you are brave enough to ask. Jane.
I was thinking, listening to you, are we sort of pagans at heart? Do we want to believe in magic, human beings? We've had so many religions. We've sought belief systems. And there's science, and there's intellect, and there's religion. But is it that we want to believe in the fairies, in magic, quite fundamentally, because reality is often too difficult, so it's better to look through some other lens?
Who wants to
philosophical
respond?
question.
Well, I mean, I could just make one comment on it. That is that, there are different levels at which you could sort of respond to that question. It's easy as that, see. I think, there are different levels that you could respond to that question. And one aspect of what you're asking about is individuals' choice to believe a certain thing or not believe a certain thing. But there's another level, and that is what's the social consequences of that? So one of the key things about having a belief is professing that belief, right? It's not just having it privately, but it's telling others that you believe that. And what that does is very powerful in terms of identifying you as part of a certain social group, right? So if everywhere in the world we look at, different ethnic groups living side by side, and one of the big differences between them is we believe that, they believe this other thing. And so there's a sort of secondary effect, a secondary reason to have a belief. It's not functioning through actually believing in it or not. Really the key function is saying that you believe that. And some psychologists, many have argued that the most powerful way to signal your allegiance to a group is profess belief in something that is impossible, like ghosts that can fly through walls and things of that kind, because it sort of gives an honest signal of your commitment to that group.
Okay, any response?
Well,
Don't worry about trivia out there.
I'm still thinking about that. But I think it's interesting, how people come to those beliefs. Like, not so much about believing in fairies, but things like people believing, anti-vaxxers. Like, I sort of wonder how they came upon, what was their belief structure in the first place that allowed that to, come into their belief system. And also, how do you counter those beliefs? Like once or horoscopes, but, once you are clinging on to those as a framework for your existence, like the acknowledgement that those beliefs aren't true can be devastating for people. Yeah, so you have to have something, ready to replace that belief with something else, because I think we all need to believe in something, although I really don't believe in anything myself. But I can be persuaded.
Well, that's a belief as well. Yes. Toby, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I think we live in an age where a lot of the time we're pragmatists. We just believe what works for us, or we're subjectivists. We believe what feels good, or we're a relativist. You have your truth, I have my truth. But really we need to be committed to the truth, which is independent of whether I want it to be true or not. And the Bible speaks about that we actually suppress the truth because we don't want the truth to be true. And I think the problem is not society and structures. I actually think the problem is the human heart, that we don't like the truth. We want to live our own little happy lives the way we want to live them, and often we shut our ears to the truth. And what we need to do is open our eyes, open our ears, and have justifiable beliefs. A belief is something you deem to be true, and you commit to that truth.
Yeah, and not just a dogma, I guess. Yeah. So this book is Death of Truth, and it's going to you, Terrence, if you're going to ask a good question. So it's by the New York Critic, and it's a really incredible book. So think of some good questions, Terrence. Maybe.
No, I am interested in the linguistics aspects.
This is a literary teacher, so.
But you have groups that would use language around, let's say, asylum seekers versus boat people. Yeah. And, both sides would argue that they're speaking the truth. So what are the mechanisms that we have to decipher? Many people don't even decipher the difference, and that might have an influence on where they come from. So what do we do?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and this is the problem with language. The thing is, with language, there are certain obvious things, ways in which you can make a true and a false statement. So, if I've got a Labrador here and I say this is my cat, that's false, right? Because we all know that cat does not include. It was not. You can't use it to refer to a Labrador. But I could say this is my Labrador, this is my dog, this is my pet. Those three words are different ways of describing something in the world, okay? They're different ways of sort of legitimately labeling that thing. So with things like asylum seekers, boat people. We had last week, after the horrific events in Sri Lanka, we had the press discussing this term Easter worshippers, as opposed to some other description, which, for example, explicitly mentioning that they were Christians. Many, many examples. Jane Gilmore's wonderful site, Fixed It. I don't know if you've seen this, where she takes headlines that report killings, domestic violence, and she crosses out in red the headline, and very often But the point about those headlines is that they're not false. She's just saying that they're completely inappropriate ways of labelling what happened. They're leaving out key information. They're foregrounding things that are wrong.
Or the descriptors, like asylum seekers or boat people, colour the rest of the article.
Yes.
They do. Yeah.
So that, I think, it's a very powerful way to play on your cognitive biases. It frames what you're going to say next, and so it's a very important problem, and it's one that I think points to part of the solution is that we've got to really be careful and ethical about the terms that we use, and be aware that it's not just about accuracy but appropriateness.
Everyone wants a question now. So, I'm going to respond to that as well. There was a question we didn't get to, but if anyone's read George Orwell's 1984, there was a quote in it where he wrote, "The political chaos is connected with the decay of language." And I think that's so evident. But also he goes on to say, but one can probably bring about some improvement by starting at the verbal end. So it shows how important words are and talking. So I'll take one more question. First hand up over here.
So a lot of this has been sort of posited on the idea that the decline in trust is a bad thing. And I would argue that in some sense the decline in trust is a good thing. And so, for example, when you talk about sexual assault in the church, I think that occurred because there was a lot of trust in an institution that wasn't critical. And so in that way, I think that at least we're now aware of some of those problems. And so I would argue it's never good to trust individuals. It's good to trust in processes. So one of the things that's really nice about the scientific method, for example, is there's a process by which you determine whether something is true or not. In a legal context, there's also a process by which you determine whether something is legally true or not. And I think if that goes back to the context of education, that people should actually be learning processes by which they can determine whether things are trustworthy or not.
Question. We know where Mick and Toby stand, so I'm going to get Kate to respond to that.
Look, I think I think what you're saying is completely accurate. And I think that especially children at school should be taught critical thinking. That is absolutely critical to our democracy. What worries me, though, is that the decline in trust, like once you've lost trust in something, it's really hard to get it back. And I just look at, what's happening in Britain. It really seems to me that in Britain and in America, democracy is actually, fracturing because of the decline in trust in say, the political figures. And in the past, we have depended on those figures to make decisions that affect us all. And if we're now losing trust in those people to make decisions for us, what do we put in its place? Because you need to trust things, but if our trust is eroding, what do we find to believe in? What do we find to, hold our, democratic society together if we don't have trust?
Can I comment on that as well? I think trust is essential to community. You can't have community without trust. So it'd be very nice to just doubt everyone, but then you'd have no relationships. And C.S. Lewis said something very famous. He said that, he's kind of speaking about romance, and he said, it's safe to lock up your heart. Don't give it to anyone, because if you give your heart to someone, it might get broken, it might get thrown on the ground, you'll get hurt. But lock it up in a casket and it won't get hurt, but it'll become hard and stony and dead ultimately. And I think that's the great problem, that a lack of trust means a lack of relationships and community, and we need trust to sustain society and our families and our relationships. So I don't think the solution is not to trust. I think it's to have a healthy skepticism that looks for the truth and looks for reasons to believe the word of other people, but not to be so cynical as to refuse to trust, because you end up very lonely.
Nick, I'll give you the final word for this evening. You're used to lecturing.
I mean, on this point, I do agree that trust, it's important not to trust, but there's a very good middle ground, I think, between these two things, and it's really what I started out with, and that is that when we talk about truth, there are not only these different kinds of truth and different kinds of claim, but very different domains in our life where, we are concerned with the truth or falsity of certain things. And so some of them is personal, and some of it is sort of in terms of, work or, what I put into my car and things like that. So it's really getting a grip. I think the fundamental issue is about what are the consequences of believing this. If I'm going to believe this, what is it a basis for me to do next? In what way does this claim stand as a reason for action, for something to do next? So those domains in which there are different consequences are really very different, right? If it's a personal relationship, the consequences are of one certain kind. If it's, am I going to survive eating this meal? The consequences are of a very different kind.
Very good. Well, I think we'll bring it to a close. It's been incredible discussion, and I encourage you to look at the Sydney Initiative for Truth and have a look. There's lots of articles and lots of contribution from different people, so really interesting. Get educated, and to read Kate's articles, of course, but to also look out for her book. When does that? It's a while? Oh, not too long. Very good. And then you can come and argue theology with Toby. He enjoys that. So please thank my panel.